So I'm going to hand over now to our colleagues at the Third Sector Research Centre, so Diarmuid, McDonnell and John Moham, as well as Alasdair Rutherford from the University of Stirling. Over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Diarmuid McDonnell. I'm a research fellow here at the Third Sector Research Centre, and along with my colleague Alasdair Rutherford, we've been assessing the impact of COVID-19 on the foundation and the dissolution of charitable organisations. So the formation of new charities and the disappearance or deregistration of existing organisations also. So what's the broad context of the study? Well, of course, the pandemic is unfortunately familiar to all of us at the moment, but specifically how it relates to our topic. We think we can identify two seemingly contradictory dynamics at play here. On the first hand, there's the very easily identifiable logic that the pandemic represents an existential threat to charitable organisations here in the UK. Charitable activities have been suspended or postponed or curtailed, sometimes indefinitely, since the beginning of this pandemic. Funding streams have been reduced, cut or even removed entirely. Also, furlough and shielding have impacted on the ability of people to volunteer. And of course, charities exist in communities, and if communities are disrupted, these organisations are also. So I think that it's not much of a stretch to say that because of these severe impacts, we might see greater levels of charities no longer being able to operate permanently. On the other hand, we've got the maybe the more positive side of the pandemic, which is that it's spurred new forms of voluntary action here in the UK. We just need to think back to the beginning of the pandemic and the formation of mutual aid associations to help people who were shielding, for example. These were informal associations, some became formal voluntary organisations, and some again further became charitable entities in their own right. And if we think of existing charities such as NHS charities or health related organisations, and how much prominence they gained in the public consciousness thanks to the work they were doing and fundraising campaigns like Captain Tom Moore, again some subsectors of the charitable sector or the broader voluntary sector quote unquote did well as a result of the pandemic. So we have two, I think, competing or seemingly contradictory dynamics at play. So why specifically foundations and dissolutions of charitable organisations? Why should we care in depth about this? Well, if we think of existing organisations and how important they are, on the one hand, it's not a stretch again to say that civil society more broadly is just going to be central in how we recover and respond to this pandemic. And as such, if we're able to create new charitable organisations, right across the spectrum of charities and the types of activities that they do, then that would be good for communities here in the UK. You mightn't give much, I think, credibility to some of the terms I'm going to mention, but if we think of levelling up, building back better, never more needed, and many others, I think they do coalesce around an essential truth, which is that charities do matter. Civil society is going to be central to how we recover. And then on the other hand, if we think of what the loss of these existing organisations would look like for communities, there's very tangible losses of physical and social infrastructure. If we think of village halls like we have here in my community, my daughter's naming ceremony was meant to be in April 2020. It was postponed till August 2020, then November 2020, and now it's in suspension indefinitely. The village hall is still a registered charity. I do know that the people involved, and they are trying to get it back up and running again, but if that was to be lost as a result of the pandemic, there would be a sizable hole in the kind of physical and social space that we have here in our community. And then if we think more instrumentally, we've got charities that provide core public goods and services. Again, some easily to call examples would be in the social care sector, nursing homes, hospices, and what the loss of these organisations would represent. Then we can also think of charities who are providing opportunities for creative and compassionate pursuits for individuals as well. and what that loss would be for communities and social fabrics. That would also be, it would be a heavy loss for our communities in the UK. And we do have some academic evidence that backs up the claims that I've just made, and also identifies some of the key kind of factors we need to take into account when we're trying to understand the formation and the disappearance of charitable organisations. Our colleague in Southampton, David Clifford, looked at the dissolution of charities in England and Wales between, I think, 1999 and about 2016. And he found these kind of, again, these twin reinforcing dynamics. One which is that a deprived area has a much lower chance of a charity being formed in it than a more affluent area. But let's say a deprived area had a charity formed in it. That charity itself then has a lower probability of survival compared to if it had set up in a more affluent area as well. So we have this twin impact on the more deprived areas of the UK. Again, charities are much less likely to be formed in them to begin with, and if they are formed, they have much lower chances of surviving also. And we pick up on some of these factors in our study also. So what's the current evidence base of the impact on the pandemic? We're not the only ones looking at this crucial topic. There are numerous high quality snapshots of cross sections of the UK voluntary sector being conducted. These are mainly in the forms of surveys, but there are some more qualitative fieldwork being conducted where possible also. A very prominent example that NCVO are involved in is the Respond, Recover, Reset project with colleagues as well, I think, at Nottingham and a few other institutions. And some of the insights that have been generated by this study are very salient. So, for example, when asked whether they believe their voluntary organisation is unlikely or very unlikely to be operating next year, about 8 to 14% of respondents have agreed. And this survey has been conducted numerous times, I think since around August 2020, and it's continuing right through 2021 also. And if we think of that 8 to 14% figure, as we're going to show very shortly, that compares to about a 3 or 4% dissolution rate in a given year in England and Wales, for example. So we're seeing a doubling or tripling of the risk of dissolution based on what charities are saying to these surveys. And there are lots of very other interesting and very salient and important findings emerging from these studies as well. We think we can do something different, however. So these surveys and qualitative fieldwork give us, timeliness, and they give us the lived experience of charities. But we're going to take an approach where we look at the regulatory data, so the kind of official administrative records that are produced by the charity regulators here in the UK, and see what kind of story that tells us about the impact of the pandemic also. So let's be very clear about our definitions and what we're talking about. So we define a foundation of a charitable organisation as the registration of a charity with the respective regulator. That's a limiting definition because it obviously excludes broader civil society and voluntary organisations. And even charities in England and Wales, if you're below a certain income threshold, you do not need to register with the Charity Commission, for instance. So there can be lots of smaller organisations that are charities in law operating throughout the pandemic that have been formed that we won't pick up in this study, unfortunately. And then when we think of dissolution, well, that's basically the obverse of the foundation definition, which is the deregistration of a charity with the respective regulator. And we think this is a bit more of a robust definition. If we think of Scotland, for example, an organisation is not legally a charity unless it is listed on the charity register. So we do have kind of good robustness and rigour with that definition also. So what we do is we draw on data from charity regulators here in the UK, in particular Charity Commission for England and Wales and Oscar in Scotland. And we also supplement it with data from Companies House, which is the registrar of companies here in the UK. That's because certain types of charities have company status. They've been incorporated, they have limited liability, etc. So we can also pick up some extra, more timely data from that regulator also. So if you were to leave now, what are the headline findings you can take away that we think we can stand over? Well, firstly, there have been fewer dissolutions in 2020 than expected, based on historical trends. So counter to the situation I outlined earlier and to the emerging findings from a lot of the surveys and fieldwork, is actually there's been fewer dissolutions. So the existential threat has not really come into play very much at all during 2020. However, for that kind of subpopulation of charities, those that have company status, and for a particular subtype of dissolution, which is insolvency, those are much higher since the pandemic began. So there have been very low numbers of insolvencies of charitable companies, but they are up around fourfold. There's been a fourfold increase in insolvencies since the pandemic began. So in general, there are fewer dissolutions than we would expect. So we can also ask the question, are charities dissolving in 2020? Do they look roughly the same as those who've been, dissolved in 2019, 2018, 2017, etc.? And the answer to that is yes. So, for instance, if most dissolved charities in a given year are based in the Northwest, and that's true in 2020 as it is in 2016, for example, and that's just something I'm making up, but or for example, if 10% of dissolved charities come from the culture and recreation centre in 2015, we're seeing roughly the same proportions in 2020 also. So the pandemic so far hasn't altered the types of charities that no longer exist, but it has altered the levels and the numbers of charities that dissolved. Then when we look at foundations, they've actually held up really well in England and Wales in particular. The relationship's a little bit weaker in Scotland. There's been lower than expected foundations of new charities, but in England and Wales in particular, we've seen almost the same numbers that we would expect based on previous years also. So let's dig into some of these findings just now. So this is the kind of long run trend in the dissolution rate of charities in England and Wales. So we see a big spike in 2009, which is mainly to do with the financial crisis. So for example, about 9% of charities that filed an annual return in 2008 were dissolved in 2009. We see a peak again at the early periods in the 2000s, but we think that's mainly to do with the regulator cleaning up the charity register and taking off charities from the register based on regulatory policy, for example. But if we zoom in on the era we're currently in 2020, we can see that there is a dip below the historical average, so just shy of 4% of charities dissolve in a given year. For 2020, it looks like it's just under 3%. And again, when we look at Scotland, it's a much more stable trend over time. We can't go quite as far back in time due to the availability of data. But again, we see a 2020 dip in the rate of dissolutions. So what we'll do now is we'll zoom into a more recent period and we'll adopt a more granular time period. So now we're looking at the monthly numbers of dissolutions in England and Wales. So typically there's about 400 charities dissolved every month in the UK and in England and Wales, and this is based on again regulatory data. There's lots of variation around that average. Some months we see 700-800 dissolutions, some months we see fewer than 100. And there's a strong seasonal pattern as well. Typically it's January and February have the highest levels of dissolutions, and it's the summer months, in particular May and August, that have the lowest numbers of dissolutions. And we've got a kind of break line set at April 2020, just to try and give us an idea of whether there's been a dip or an increase in the monthly average or the monthly numbers of dissolutions. I think we can clearly see there's been a shift in the level at the time the pandemic began here in the UK, and we haven't really seen the level increase back up to some of those seasonal highs just yet either. So there seems to be, I think, some tentative evidence that we have seen fewer monthly dissolutions as a result of the pandemic.
There's a lot of variation month to month in the number of removals, and also some seasonal patterns when more charities are removed at some times of year than others. In order to smooth this, we estimate a time series model with quarterly controls before March 2020, which is represented by the solid blue line in this graph for England and Wales. We then forecast this pre-COVID model forward into the pandemic, represented by the dashed blue line. Finally, we estimate an interrupted time series model that fits the pattern of dissolutions post-March 2020, shown by the red line. So this allows us to compare what we would have expected without COVID to what did happen by looking at the difference between the dashed blue line and the solid red line. And this controls for both the long-term trend and also the seasonal variation. And here it clearly shows a large and sustained drop in charity dissolutions during COVID for England and Wales. We use the same approach for Scotland. Again, we extend the pre-COVID model past March 2020 and compare it to the red post-COVID model. In Scotland, we see the same immediate drop in charity dissolutions at the start of lockdown that we saw in the data for England and Wales. But for Scotland, this has then risen steeply back to normal levels by about March 2021, when there's no longer a difference from the longer term trend. This third graph uses different data. It describes the number of charitable companies wound up due to insolvency. So it's a more limited sample, only charities that are also limited companies, and it's more extreme, only those who were insolvent when they were closing down. And this graph also shows only the charitable companies in England and Wales. Typically, we see only 1 or 2 insolvencies in a month, and there are many months pre-COVID with none at all. So again, we fit a pre-COVID model represented by the solid blue line and forecast it forwards post-March 2020. The red line then represents the interrupted time series model fitted to the post-COVID data. We can see a very large spike in insolvencies early in lockdown. While this has then been on a downward trend over the past 12 months, it is still above the long-term trend even now. We do need to take a little bit of care in interpreting this pattern, because we are just looking here at a specific subset of the sector, charitable companies. And we're talking small numbers of events here, only 6 to 8 organisations per month that are insolvent even during COVID. But the pattern does suggest a pretty big increase in financial distress for at least some charities during COVID lockdown that contrasts with the pattern we see in the charity deregistrations.
What does the picture look like internationally? So is what's happening in England and Wales and Scotland, is that typical of charity sectors more broadly? So we supplemented the data we had earlier with information from regulators in Canada, the USA, New Zealand, Australia, and in Northern Ireland also. There's a caveat with the data for Northern Ireland at the moment. There's been a recent court case which has affected the operations of the regulator, so it's difficult to put much stock in the findings just now for that jurisdiction. But when we compare it to New Zealand, for example, or Canada, Australia, we actually see, with the exception of the US, dissolutions are down right across the board across multiple charity jurisdictions. And then if we switch to foundations and employ again the same analysis, we're going to look at the same kind of the same plots and the same graphs. Here again we've got the monthly numbers of foundations of charities in England and Wales. Again, there's variation around an average. We typically see about 450 new charities added to the register in a given month. Again, there's seasonality which we can kind of see again. So summer months are usually reasonably high for foundations, And again, kind of winter months or into the spring is when foundations are usually at their lowest. So again, if we look at that dividing line there at April 2020, we can see that there hasn't really been an initial shift in the number of foundations, but as we start progressing into 2021, there does seem to be quite a dramatic decline in the number of new charities being registered in England and Wales.
Looking at the modelling, we fitted the same interrupted time series models to the charity registration data. You can see here that the longer term trend in charity registrations is pretty stable and only has a small seasonal pattern, although there is quite a lot of variance month to month around that trend. That's the solid blue line, and then forecast forward with the dashed line into the COVID period. The post-COVID model shows that registrations held up in mid-2020 and the months immediately following lockdown. But since then, there has been a sharp decline in new charities being registered, with no sign of this picking up again as we move through 2021. This might represent the lead time involved in forming a new charity, with those registered in mid-2020 perhaps having been conceived pre-COVID and some of the groundwork done then. But overall, it does suggest that the upsurge in voluntary action during COVID hasn't really been reflected in the creation of new charities, at least not in a sustained way, and instead is perhaps a combination of involvement and activity in existing organisations and more informal community action.
And once again, the international comparison I guess backs up, well, it's a bit more of a mixed picture actually. The USA, New Zealand, England and Wales foundations have held up really well. They're actually slightly above average based on the previous 5 years. As I said, in Scotland, it's a bit weaker. There's been considerably fewer registrations of new charities observed in 2020 based on what we would expect from 2015 to 2019. In Canada, it's quite dramatically lower. We're not quite sure with Canada if it's to do with regulatory operations or if it's a real phenomenon where there are just fewer charities being formed. So yeah, thank you for following us through with that presentation and how we conducted this study. We're incredibly interested in what you have to say about what we've done in general and about a few particular areas which I'll cover just now. So what do we think we can kind of stand over as key messages? Well, I think it's well supported by the evidence we've shown that there have been fewer dissolutions observed than we would expect based on historical trends, and this is even allowing for disruptions to the regulators' operations in the early days of the pandemic in particular. So it does seem that existential threat, if it is to happen, certainly hasn't happened just yet. So we think this might be indicative of a scenario where charities are currently in stasis. So there are organisations that for all intents and purposes are not operating and have no intention to operate ever again, but simply haven't notified the regulator. And that's not a judgment against the individuals, that just could simply be due to capacity. We know there are legal barriers to dissolving a charity depending on your legal status, whether your constitution actually allows you to hold virtual meetings to take such a decision such as dissolution. So we do think there's some kind of stasis in the sector where organizations at some point will have to notify the regulator, or the regulator will have to perform some kind of cleaning of the register in a future date, and will look back and say actually X amount of charities were ceased operating in June 2020, for example. And then if we look at registration, so the foundation of new charities, these were kind of maintained, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, so the first lockdown, here in the UK, April to July 2020. But we have started to see a more dramatic decline, I think particularly in England and Wales. So this may represent the fact that the new charities that were formed in the summer of 2020, well, the preparation and the legwork was conducted in spring 2020 or in late 2019, for example. So it was just simply a case of filing the final paperwork and the charity could begin operating. And maybe now what we're seeing is because of the pandemic, in autumn, winter 2020, people who would have set up a charity haven't had the time to do the paperwork or the legwork, have been dissuaded for a multitude of reasons. And now we're seeing this kind of decline in new charities being formed. When we look at a particular type of dissolution, we can see that the insolvencies of charitable companies are quite considerably up on historical trends. Again, from a very low base, we see 1 to 2 insolvencies per quarter typically, and now we're seeing 4 or 5 per quarter since April 2020. Now, the question we want to kind of consider, and we would like some feedback in particular from you, is are these insolvencies a leading indicator of dissolutions that are going to happen down the line in the broader charity sector? So charitable companies have to report on matters to the Companies House in a more timely fashion than they do to the charity regulator for England and Wales, for example. So really, our insolvencies really just, they've just it's just been better reported, and pretty soon we're going to see dissolutions better reported in England and Wales and Scotland. Also, you may feel differently. You may think quite logically that charitable companies are quite different from a typical charity, and that there's no association between the level of insolvencies and the level of dissolution. So this is something I guess we can only observe maybe with more data and as time passes, but we would like to hear your thoughts on that. If you have some, that would be fantastic. So again, like a final point we could make is that there's a contrast between the data we can get from Companies House, so that's on insolvencies, and data from the Charity Commission, for example, so the regulatory data that we get. So maybe the latter, so maybe the regulatory data on charities is masking, financial distress. The last thing I think we want to kind of propagate here today is the idea that the existential threat is not real. All these apocalyptic prognostications of demise and financial deterioration are just that. They're just prognostications that have no real basis in fact. Yeah, I think that would be much too strong a claim to make. I think the regulatory data are really masking, the turmoil and the financial distress that charities are dealing with just now. And if we were to, I think, maybe make a prediction, we would expect to see dissolutions increase probably quite dramatically in the near future. But that's speculation, and we definitely want to hear from you now. So thank you very, very much for joining us, and looking forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our university partners for such an interesting presentation. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and discussion later, and thanks to those who've already put questions in the chat. We will come back to those after we've heard 2 responses from colleagues in the sector. The first one is going to be from Tom Collins, who's Policy Manager at New Philanthropy Capital. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'd just like to echo that was a fascinating presentation, and I think the more kind of hard, rigorous data work we can have done on the sector, the better, frankly, because there's a real lack. For me, the top line finding from what we've just heard was that there were less dissolutions than we would have expected in an average year, and then bearing in mind the year that we've just had and the kind of worries about existential risk for the sector that were referenced, that's quite remarkable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that might be the case, at least in the short term. And I think what I think it means for the sector's kind of relationship with government and with the public, especially bearing in mind that the sector kind of went out with quite dire warnings, and we all did, and that everyone was deeply worried about what the state of the sector was going to be in a year's time as the crisis kicked off. Asked for support from government, didn't get the level of support that it wanted, and therefore you would expect that the logical conclusion would be there would be failure, there would be a negative consequence. And this research seems to suggest that the opposite is true. So let's think of it. I'm going to speculate a bit about why I think that might be and why it's not necessarily as simple as that. So in the first instance, these findings, while they might look surprising, are in a sense not that surprising, because charities, as we understand them, don't fail in the same way that businesses do. They tend to not fail quickly, suddenly, and dramatically. They tend to kind of fade out rather than have a big snap moment where everything comes to a head and it has to end. It might take years. It might involve scaling back. It might involve perhaps joining up with other charities and just a gradual kind of winnowing down. So there's a sense in which we didn't expect to see a big bump in deregistrations or a big increase in closures and the kind of early part of the crisis. We think it's probably more likely that we'll see a kind of more gradual increase as the years go on, which will be affected by other factors, like if there's a recession off the back of this, if there's more austerity off the back of this as well. But we also know from our qual work last year, we did a bunch of qual work, spoke to a lot of different charities about how they were experiencing the crisis, that the level of burnout in the sector, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this firsthand, is kind of unreal. The work that people have been doing, the levels that they've been working at are kind of unsustainable. And I think it's quite likely that that will feed into this sort of long fade out phenomenon that we see in charities, where people are essentially so burnt out that they don't deregister and don't necessarily do the things which they perhaps they should do, but of course there's mitigating factors. So that's that kind of long fade out burnout phenomenon. I think that's one contributing factor to the lack of deregistrations. But then there's an interesting challenge to that perspective, also contained in the research, which is that in 2008 we saw a massive increase in deregistrations very suddenly in response to that crisis, and we didn't see it here. So they're very different crises, but what are the main differences? I think it's interesting to try and understand that and think about what the implications might be. One that immediately springs to mind is income. We know the income of some charities has been very badly hit. We know that people that depend on retail and people that depend on event fundraising have really suffered, but we don't have good data, really rigorous data across the whole sector about what has happened with the overall income of the sector. We know historically in 2008-9, thanks to NCVO Almanac, that the income for the sector dropped by about £2 billion. And there was a corresponding big increase in deregistrations. Recent work by CAF, like the Giving Monitor 2020, UK Giving 2020, suggested that donations from individuals, at the very least, were holding up. And we do know that there have been winners and losers in this pandemic, both as individuals. Some people have more disposable income than they did before. Obviously, some people have less. But that potential funding stream is out there for charities who can access it through maybe pivoting to digital and things like that. So that's one potential reason. Another potential reason why the picture may not be quite as bad as it has seemed. And then finally, I think the really important one, the kind of elephant in the room, the big thing which we haven't discussed, is the government's interventions in the course of this crisis, which is the big difference between now and 2008, when it was a very, very different picture. Obviously, we had the 750 million package for charities, which I think most people across the sector agree was inadequate. It doesn't support the whole sector. It didn't necessarily even reach all the sectors that were worst impacted by the crisis, but it was at least something. And then the other big one is furlough. I think furlough has two potential impacts. On one hand, it props up charities whose incomes are being kind of specifically COVID targeted. The charity shop dependent ones, the event fundraising dependent ones. But it also probably, and this is just speculation to a degree on my part, it probably allows organisations which probably would have closed down under normal circumstances to keep lurching on in a sort of vaguely zombie format longer than they otherwise would have done. So it will be really interesting to see what happens. The scheme ends in September. And if there is going to be a kind of sudden tidal wave of deregistrations, it may be that is actually the precipitating factor. It may also be that the scheme has actually just worked, and we have to give credit to the government, and it's a good policy intervention. I know that it doesn't work well for many in the sector. I know that many were advocating for it to be adjusted and reformed to make it easier for example, charity workers to be furloughed and continue to work to help deliver the essential services that were needed during the crisis. But there is some limited evidence, again, not to the level of rigor that we've seen in the presentation today, but there is some evidence that uptake of furlough across the sector was pretty high. 33% reported by the Association of Medical Research Charities among their members. David Kane did some calculations and estimated about 180,000 people in the charity sector may have been furloughed in the last year. So it may have just worked in terms of tiding charities over through the most difficult bit of the crisis, and fingers crossed, that's actually the best possible outcome. So in this scenario where it looks like, at least for the moment, the worst outcomes have been avoided, what does that mean? I mean, does it mean that the sector is all right? Clearly not. I think anyone who watches it and anyone who is around and talking to people knows that there are still major problems. We put together at MPC last year, I tried to put together a resource that looked at redundancies across the sector, because there were several large high profile redundancies announced in major charities and smaller ones too. It was very difficult, but we found around 7,000 redundancies just in the period from the beginning of COVID to the end of the year. That's probably the tip of the iceberg, because it's only the publicly announced ones. The other people have done great calculations. But fundamentally, what we need is going forwards, and in terms of our relations with government and how people understand what happened in the crisis, is we need a data-led understanding as rigorous as this of the impact that we've had and the number of people that we've helped in the face of these straitened and difficult times. I think we're a decent way off from that, but hopefully we'll get towards it with more initiatives like this soon.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was super interesting as well. Really great to hear from you. I'm now going to hand over to our final speaker before we get to questions. Our final speaker is Iona Lawrence. Iona is an independent consultant, and she's doing a focus piece of work at the moment on organisation endings. Iona, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for coming, but especially to colleagues for what a really interesting conversation so far. So as Sarah says, I'm an independent consultant, but I've only been one for 3 years, and before this I ran the Joe Cox Foundation, which I set up in memory of my friend. So I come to the work I'm doing and that I'm going to tell you a bit more about with the kind of framing of having led an organisation from the very beginning, and that offers, I think, quite a lot of perspective to the work that we're doing. So unlike Tom, MPC, which lots of people are aware of what they do, I'm just going to spend a few moments explaining what the work is that we do and where it came from before kind of offering some reflections on the conversation so far. So the project that I'm co-leading at the moment is called Stewarding Loss, and it was initiated in 2019 by Cassie Robinson, whose day job is in the lottery, but this was very much with her independent hat on. And with the support of the Paul Hamlin Foundation, since 2019, we've been exploring organisational endings. And by that, we mean specifically closure or merger. And our work is rooted in the belief that endings and new beginnings are a part of the natural cycle of growth and change, renewal and innovation in civil society. And that as we think about this, particularly as COVID arrived, we think about it in a kind of related way, in that there are some organisations for whom circumstances will require them to close, and it's not necessarily a decision that they've taken. And then in other circumstances, there can be a more upstream or preventative decision to close, and that might be for any number of reasons, including the work is complete, they're keen to make sure that like perhaps a founder's leaving and they can't find an appropriate successor. So we encompass a lot of very diverse things, but broadly we're really interested in what a stronger field of organisational endings look like. Because if you look at the beginning of an organisation, the resources, the leadership programmes, the accelerators, the support, the frameworks, the toolkits that there are to set up an organisation, there is none of that applied to the end, and we think that the sector loses for that. So over the last year and a half or so, we have worked with over 150 non-profit professionals to understand what their experiences of organisational endings are and where they see the gaps being. And we've heard loud and clear that there is too little talk of endings, of loss and organisational closure throughout the life cycle of non-profits. And that there's also too little resource, too little budget and ambition about what good endings look like. And so responding to the needs that we've heard, we've done a range of things, from holding open discussion spaces for people to share their experiences. We've initiated an inquiry specifically for funders to explore their role in better endings. We've hosted events to explore what narratives and stories we need in order to inspire people with what's possible. And we've also published dedicated tools and resources which are designed to support organisations who are looking to close to do so with care and intention and a focus on legacy. And we were really pleased last month that we were in a position to be able to launch the Careful Closures Fund, which is designed specifically to support 4 organisations to consider, design and undertake a closure or a merger, the learning from which will be used to further guide the work that we do. So I suppose it won't come as a surprise that what interests me about the conversations so far today is that there are a number of assumptions perhaps around closures being necessarily a bad thing, which obviously in circumstances where there's not time and resource and energy to do them well, that is bad, and especially where the work perhaps hasn't been invested in properly, that is bad. But we ourselves don't necessarily see opportunities for us to close things well as a bad thing, and that in fact the potential delay in a possible wave of closure isn't a moment necessarily for us as people who are interested in or have stakes in the sector to sit around thankful that the closures haven't yet arrived, but actually we need to get our ducks in a row and make sure that as and when the closure comes, we're putting things in place so that whether it's a kind of single drop off and a cliff edge, or if it, as Tom has said, is something that's slightly more kind of long and arching, that we have the resources, we have the experts, we have the support ready to support organisations to do it as well as possible. So thinking about that, I'm just going to say a few reflections about the things we've learned about what better endings could look like and why they matter, and then finish with a few very top line reflections on what this could mean for the sector and how it's shaping our work going forward. So I probably don't need to say this, but why this matters, why we're interested in this work, is for a range of reasons. We've heard over the last year and a half that the cost of bad endings is really etched very deeply into our landscape in ways that often we don't give ourselves time to think about. So without the thought to legacy, what comes next? Programs and hard-earned intelligence are just flushed away overnight because organisations haven't had the time and the resource to really invest in where legacy lies for an organisation. Without time for emotions, so so much of the support is often like, what are the legal or practical or technical steps? But we've heard more times than not, people want to start with the emotional journey, and without space for that, people go forward into new organisations, new jobs, to create new things, carrying all of the kind of trauma or the burden of that bad ending. Without careful planning, money and assets are inefficiently dispensed of, and without knowledge of the complex legalities, which we've all too often heard people get wrong, very well-meaning mistakes are made and staff and trustees end up the wrong side of the law. So I've just alluded to some of the barriers that we've perceived and we've heard about in terms of what stands between where we are now and what a kind of healthier non-profit landscape could look like, with better endings as a part of it. And there are kind of 5 things I'd like to draw your attention to. The first is, which is why it's great that this conversation is happening, right? But we need more of it. There is a lack of open conversation about endings in the sector. It's a taboo subject. You know, a lot of my work in the last year and a half has had people email me being like, I hear you're doing the endings thing. Can we talk? And what we're trying to do is bring this topic out into the open. The second is there is often a survival at all cost mentality that can set in amongst trustees and staff. And we heard some of this from the presentation and from Tom as well. But like a survival at all cost mentality creates an environment where staff and trustees don't take decisions around ending in a way that's early enough in order to provide time to do it well. And third of all, there are actually loads of people who are really good at this stuff. There are coaches, facilitators, advisors, consultancies who can all support organisations to consider and design better endings. But these people, partly because it's a taboo, partly because there's no funding for this work really, these people are very hard to find. So we've heard a lot from organisations that they only realise in hindsight after the ending that bringing in an external consultant would have provided a really invaluable external perspective. And there were lots of them, but it's impossible because if you Google how do I close my charity, all you get is the Charity Commission's website and some really brilliant stuff from infrastructure organisations, but not here is the field of people that can help you. The fourth is that, and I've alluded to this already, but it's really important. Nonprofits all too often lack the time and the money. There's stuff to do it well. It needs budget to keep the right people in place for just long enough that things are planned well. And then second of all, you need time so that you can plan it and you can identify the external partners who might pick up on work. You can write the story of your organisation and get out ahead of the kind of the wider sector and dictate and share what the story is that you want. And then the fifth is that the bulk of the support on offer is often focused on technical, practical and logistical. And as I've already said, through our conversations over the past year, people more than often talk about the anger, the despair, the relief, the shame, the guilt and the grief. And none of this is really ever accommodated for in the process and the design of an ending. And we're really interested in what it looks like to couple a kind of an emotional journey alongside the practical one. I wonder if in the kind of notes after this call, I can share what a bit about some of the work we've done and the tools we've done, which, as I said earlier, really very much a version 1 of where we hope to get to. And at the heart of that lies our 7 principles for a better ending, which I won't walk you through now because I think you'll all fall asleep. But I think it's an interesting piece of work and is very much being put out there to kind of hopefully inspire people to kind of think about whether or not they agree with them, but then also as we're doing with this fund, really start testing whether those principles can drive and deliver better endings. So as I said, I'm just going to finish by a few reflections, and these are just a few emerging thoughts rather than any really kind of concrete recommendations. But we've heard time and again that funders are they're key to this whole ecosystem getting endings better. And we think that there are kind of 3 things that funders could do. First of all, they could signal intent. They could talk like openly in the sector about how they see endings coming down the line and they want to initiate conversations with grantees before the critical moment, which could then end up with time and money being on people's side. We also think that this endings aren't just for the end. Endings should start from the beginning. And so we're really excited to be talking to a range of trusts and foundations about embedding some of our work in a Funder Plus model, which we've already started piloting with people like Paul Hamlin. But also, what would it look like to have grant contracts having kind of stipulating that certain conversations could or should be happening on a regular enough basis about kind of ongoing sustainability of the organisation and whether or not endings could be a part of any kind of future scenario planning. Not necessarily believing that those conversations lead to an ending, but that in having these conversations regularly, you create the kind of impetus for time and money to be on your side if that moment comes. And then most importantly, we think funders have a role in providing dedicated resource for this, and we're excited to be working with a range of funders on what a pooled fund could look like, but we don't think that that could come soon enough, because were the organisations that you're talking about perhaps needing to close in the autumn when furlough ends happen, we're not going to have our ducks in a row by then, and that means that organisations out there will not have the time and money to think about it. So we think that funders have a really key role to play. And then there are a few other things that we think are important, and we do genuinely think that anyone with an interest in the charity sector has a role in this. So we think that chief execs and boards could kind of feel more confident and be supported to feel more confident to talk about the elephant in the room. As I said, talking about endings don't make them inevitable. It just creates endings which are purposeful and intentful, and you're less likely to be caught by surprise if it happens further down the line. So what can we do to challenge some of the stereotypes around heroic leadership and sort of failure being kind of something we avoid, in order to kind of usher in more space for a nuanced conversation about endings not necessarily being the worst thing that could happen. And then finally, whether it's infrastructure groups or sector commentators or the media, we really need to surface story of what's good looks like. I could tell you all of the amazing founders in the sector who are kind of lauded by us all for being fantastic people at starting things. I also know loads of really brilliant people who've done a seriously good job at bringing an organisation to a close with the support of beneficiaries and communities and staff and trustees. And I would really love to see a kind of a more open and honest conversation about those experiences, and also the things that have not just gone well but also gone more challengingly, because I think that could be a really useful kind of inflection point for the wider sector to really sit up and take notice. So I will stop there, and I wanted to say thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to all your questions.
Thank you so much, Iona. That was absolutely fascinating, really interesting reflections there. And there's some really good stuff in the chat already. I'm going to move us swiftly to the Q&A. There was a question earlier on, very specifically about whether mergers and collaborations is in scope of this research. Alasdair or John, I don't know whether you want to come back on that briefly.
So we haven't looked at mergers so far, but that's certainly something we could extend this work to look at. I guess in terms of the data in the regulatory data, there won't be that many, so it'll be a relatively small sample, but that's certainly something we could extend to look at as well. Sure, but not something we've looked at yet.
Thanks very much, Alasdair. And then I think there was also a couple of questions around social enterprises and community interest companies, around whether they've had a greater proportion of deregistrations than charities, given that social enterprises and KICs rely more on earned income, and that's obviously been particularly impacted by the pandemic.
Diarmuid might want to, yeah.
Go. So thanks to David Kane has been mentioned a few times. So he has pulled a good data set together on KICs. So we can certainly look at registrations and deregistrations for those. I'd be happy if somebody pointed me to a good source of data about social enterprises. I think that could be a neat kind of sub comparison that would be worth looking at. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. And then Alex, I think there was another question around volunteering, actually, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. So this was a question from Robin Causley, and kind of Robin asks, is there kind of a bigger non-financial threat to small voluntary and community groups, in the kind of the loss, certainly the loss of volunteers during the pandemic and the inability to replace them as we come out of lockdown? Any reflections from the panel there?
Do you want to take that one?
We're not going to pick this up from this particular data source, because at the moment so the returns we're using for this exercise don't include and certainly don't yet include numbers of volunteers, as many people in the room will know. Organisations are requested by the Charity Commission to report that, but some of the data on that is a bit spotty, and we don't have very good trend data on it. So in the narrow sense of, can we say this purely on the basis of the sources we've been using here, no, we can't. It's not even too early to tell. I just don't think we can do it.
Thanks very much, John. That's really helpful. I think just to add on that answer, certainly another research project that NCVA has been involved in, where we have been asking kind of monthly questions of the sector around what's happening to volunteering, has certainly shown kind of lower levels of participation. And I think, you know, there's been some quite high profile recruitment campaigns around volunteering in the sector. For example, the Scouts trying to get people to come back to volunteer post-pandemic. So I think it's a really good question to ask, actually. But I think also to remember that it's been quite a mixed picture during COVID in terms of what's happened to volunteering. And I think some people have volunteered for the first time, whereas others have stepped back. And so I think it's quite an interesting kind of crossroads for the sector, really, in terms of what happens to volunteering and what happens next. But of course, it's a really important resource as well as financial resources for the sector. Alex, have we got any other questions at the moment in the chat?
There were some more questions kind of around CICs. So kind of community interest companies. I'm not sure if we kind of explored them all. So there was also a question around that kind of John, you had picked up in the chat a little bit around kind of the rate of closures or formations of community interest companies and what data we might have available there. John, I know you picked up the point that Tanya made from 360 Giving, asking around the kind of the proportion of deregistrations around earned income, but I wondered if there's anything else we might want to say there. And also from Rich Bacon, kind of have CICs been registering in a greater number than new charities in proportion to pre-COVID? So some specific questions there around community interest companies.
Do you want to add anything there, Alasdair?
Yeah, I mean, Joe might want to come in as well. I mean, I guess broadly we haven't seen dramatic differences in the dissolutions and the registrations compared to the historic data and the types of organisations. I'm not sure if we've specifically picked out a legal form and kicks. Diarmuid, do you want to comment on that?
No, not yet, but it is something we could look at. Yeah, there is good data.
Thanks very much, Diarmuid. Are there any other questions in the chat? If not, I can ask a question just while we're waiting for others. I just wondered about other kind of indicators of financial distress that perhaps wouldn't have been picked up in this data. I'm thinking things like, for example, if charities are late filing their accounts, or kind of, you know, other indicators that might suggest that the sector is struggling financially. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, we have been looking at the more sort of timely data. So obviously there's more accounts coming in month by month, and we are comparing that data as it comes in, and as charities, if they pass deadlines for non-filing, then we're starting to look at that. I guess it's been complicated by some of those deadlines being extended, and so we're talking about different time periods if we compare it to historical non-filing rates, and there's some sort of selection as to who might file when, and to make sure that that's representative. But that's certainly something we're monitoring. That's the more kind of live data that we look at. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Alasdair. And just to pick up on something that Tom said, to what extent do you think that the furlough scheme has actually been kind of, I guess, masking what otherwise perhaps would have been closures in the charity sector?
Can I just throw something in here, which is that obviously that relates to organisations that have got employees, which is probably at best 30 to 35% of the total number of organisations. I don't know what, I don't know whether there's upper or lower limits on the furlough scheme, for example, which may further constrain the numbers. So I think it's something, if we're able to match up what we know about spending on furlough, I think we have got company or organisation level data on furloughing. We could possibly do something. I think the issue here is, of course, that it is a potential limitation of this kind of work. We tend to focus on single indicators, and obviously, as our panelists have highlighted, the complexities of circumstances that lead eventually to organisational demise tend to be, somewhat unique to individual organisations. It's a mixture of factors, and so in that sense, to say that there's one magic bullet that sustained the sector, or two magic bullets in the case of the government's support plus furloughing, I think that is likely to be oversimplifying what looks like a strong case at first sight. We'll know what contribution those initiatives made relative to the typical resource base for an individual organisation. Whether we can simply attribute that on its own to staving off closure, I think is not something we go so far as to say.
Thanks so much, John. That was a really thorough response. Alex, do you have any more questions, or do you have a question?
Yeah, no, I have on a different tack. So Lev asks about kind of support packages or funds available to support closures and mergers. And I know Iona kind of was kind of alluded to some of the kind of funding certainly that Student Loss have had available. But Iona, I wonder if you might be able to share any wider support packages that you know that is supporting organisations through some either discussions around closures or kind of mergers.
Yes, of course. So yeah, Lev, thanks for your question and for your message. I'd love to be in touch. There isn't enough of, I think, what you're asking for. So that's sort of what we're here to try and encourage and catalyse, but very much aware that the best people to do this work and support organisations are people who have existing relationships. So lots of our work is about working in partnership with infrastructure bodies like NCVO to support the work that they already do brilliantly in this area, but also to work with funders to support them to support their grantees. In terms of dedicated funding, this Careful Closures Fund that I mentioned earlier that I'd love to send you information on is quite unique. It is dedicated funding that is provides two key things. So the first is one, a kind of unrestricted grant for the grantee to be able to cover costs associated with staff time and other things needed in order to engage in the process, and then dedicated paid for support from a team of consultants called Deeds and Words who've supported organisations to close before. And together with both of those things, we hope that over 6 to 9 months, grantees could go through a process that's given the time and space it needs to both anticipate, design, and then start delivering a closure or a merger. So that's a kind of pilot of what we think the sector might need, but obviously what we're doing is trying something new. So it might not quite be this. We might be having a slightly different conversation in a year's time, depending on how this funding goes. But in support alongside that, there are lots of things that are existing available. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but the infrastructure groups, whether it's Small Charities Coalition or NCVO, have really brilliant resources that complement stuff that comes from the regulator as well. And then specific groups, whether it's locality or others, deliver kind of certain types of quite small, perhaps resilience funding to try and support organisations who find themselves between 2 financial years and they need a bridge funding. But I suppose at the heart of your question lies my response, which is that I think in a year, 2 years time, if we've seized this opportunity that we have to really take the time to think about how we support organisations to close as well as possible, we'll be looking at quite a vastly different landscape, perhaps where funders have reserved funds available for their grantees at any moment in time to pull down on if they're considering closure, or as well alongside any sort of pooled funding that might exist specifically to support organisations to think about and design this stuff well.
Thanks, Iona. Alex, I think there's a comment as well for Iona before I go back to Katie's question.
There was a comment from Mandy in the chat, just saying that certainly from an infrastructure body perspective, it would be great to hear more about kind of Iona's work. So that was the main comment that Mandy's put into the chat box.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Yeah, because I think what she's saying is that organisations often come too late, and it's too late. All you can do is support the insolvency bit rather than being able to kind of mitigate the impact.
Yeah, and Mandy, that's something that we've heard lots and lots of times, and it's sort of a driver, but also one of the leverage points for what it looks like to get this stuff right or do it better, I think, because funders would also say the same thing. I've had lots of informal conversations with funders who say there's nothing we can do about it. If grantees won't come to us, in good enough time we can't help them. And we'd say that is true, but also there are kind of fundamental power dynamics here. And I think it's slightly different for infrastructure groups, but for funders, for instance, with the way that endings are talked about and perceived in the sector right now, it's no surprise that grantees want to withhold information, and the kind of anticipation of a possible need to close, with it being such an area of taboo or stigma in the sector. So that's why I think really what we want to do is support, and we're looking forward to, and it's very much in its infancy right now, but as I say, kind of growing and deepening partnerships with organisations like NCVO is about supporting a kind of more nuanced, robust and open conversation about this stuff in the sector, so that in time that filters down into the sort of leadership groups who feel confident not just to have the conversations internally in a kind of upstream way, but also all relevant kind of stakeholders, whether it's infrastructure bodies and the support they offer or funders and the role they can play, that everything becomes more upstream. Because as one of the kind of people in the community of practice we're growing around this stuff talked about, there's sort of a funnel, right? And if the further up the funnel, the more time and choices and resource you probably have, and that the further down you push these conversations, and the further down the funnel you go, the fewer options you're left. And that's why infrastructure organisations like yours end up with people being like, "Oh, it's too late, help!" And then all you can do is help mitigate the very worst impact of a closure that's not been designed or resourced properly. And we're really about trying to encourage everyone to think about these things in a much more upstream way.
Thanks, Iona. Sorry, I couldn't find a mute then. That's brilliant. I'm going to go back to Alex. I think we've got another question going back more onto the financial side of things.
Yep, so this is a question from Katie at RunYoung50. And Katie asks, are there a lot of dissolutions and foundations related to charities that were not limited by guarantee, changing to charitable incorporated organisations? When Katie looked at the last Charity Commission report on closures, most seem to be re-registering as CIOs. So are we seeing a shift across different entities rather than closing and foundations?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's certainly a factor in the data. That's another reason that organisations close and start, because of that conversion process. And so that is something we have to look at, and that will explain some of the spikes that we've seen historically. I guess it plays to Iona's point that not all closures are bad. That's a positive reason for closure. In fact, it's not. It looks like a closure, but it's not the organisation ceasing. So I guess, yes, we can take account of that. And perhaps part of the pattern are organizations putting on hold that conversion. That would obviously affect both measures. I guess also what we do is look at the net flow of charities, and obviously a charity doing that conversion would balance out, because it would be a removal and a registration. And if we see a change in that kind of net flow, then that's independent of those sorts of conversions. But it does show that the data is complicated. There are complicated reasons for organizations to be added and removed, and it's not always straightforward. I mean, I guess one of the things that we're worrying about is that part of the reason for organizations delaying being removed might be related to financial distress, that organizations that are in financial distress will be more complicated to wind up, will be having a messier ending, as I described it, and the being removed from the register kind of comes at the end of that process. So that might actually be an indicator that those closures are messier than they would otherwise have been, and that's obviously concerning. On the other side, we will expect to see an increase in the number of closures coming back as people catch up, and we shouldn't be overly concerned about that, because we would expect to see a catch up and a return to trend, and that in itself is not a bad thing. So we also have to be careful not to overreact when we see that surge the other way, but really look at it over the longer term as to whether there's been a big effect or not. I don't know if Diarmuid wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, just that we can disaggregate by different types of closure. Those of you who are kind of, I guess, data wonks like us, the Charity Commission have updated everything recently. There's much more information available, but they have changed codes and variable names. So we're in the process of refining what we've done in the past with that. But yeah, we can disaggregate by legal form of the charity itself and the type of closure, and we can look at those over time as well. Yeah, so that's a good suggestion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really thorough answers. Thank you. Alex, I'm going to come back to you. Any final reflections? We've probably got about a minute left.
Oh gosh, it was just one final reflection, was just I think some really interesting discussions around kind of volunteers and furlough in the sector. So I think the point made earlier around charities are obviously different to private sector organisations in that once a business runs out of money, they can't pay their staff and they kind of have to close up. Of course, charities are different, and the vast majority rely on volunteers to keep organisations going. So I think that puts charities in a different position. And just on the furloughing, of course, it could be masking kind of big things going on underneath. But again, just worth remembering, 46% of the sector has a turnover of under £10,000. They're not hiring staff, or very few are. 81% of the sector have a turnover of less than 100k. So we're probably not going to see huge numbers of people winding up their charities because there aren't that many that are kind of employing staff that might be affected. Not to say that there won't be thousands of organisations impacted by furlough, but as a proportion of the sector, it's still relatively small. So those are just some of my final reflections. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Alex. So just to end with some thank yous. So thank you to Alasdair, Diarmuid, John, Tom and Iona for being a fantastic panel today and for your presentations and reflections. And thank you so much to all of you for coming along and for your really insightful questions. Very final thing I was just going to say is just give a small plug for the VSSN conference, which is coming up in September. The early bird tickets will be available next week. Alex has just put the link to the conference in the chat. So please do have a look at that and have a look. It's a brilliant agenda. Great to see everyone today. Thanks so much for joining us and hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.